Comic books have been around in some form or another for over 100 years. And it's an incredible thing that we have so many comics. Unfortunately, many of the olden time books aren't even available anymore. But there are plenty of books from the 60s, 70s, 80s that you can enjoy that we would consider to be old. Hell, comics from when I started reading comics can be considered old these days. And so the question is, with new fans, theoretically, popping up all the time, and many who have popped up over the last 20 years not having gone backwards, the question is, are old comics, with old meaning, 10, 20 years before you got into comics, are they worth reading?
When I think of old comics, it's funny because before we recorded, we were like, "Is Bennett's New Avengers old?" Maybe to somebody, but like when I think of old comics, I think of when I opened up my dad's comics that he kind of uh, gave to me. After I started getting into them, and I was rifling through issues of like Buscema Spider Man and Claremont's X Men, an early issue from the '60s of Captain America fighting the Masters of Evil. That was like that shit was beat up, it was falling apart. But there's just something, I don't know, really just rewarding to do that archaeology. I think especially when it comes to like physical issues and back issues and stuff. I think there's a real funness there because those books do not read like current comics do. We have decompressed storytelling, whereas that stuff was all compressed. You were reading entire what would be arcs now. You'd get in half an issue. These things were moving; they were moving at a clip, and it's kind of refreshing almost. It kind of loops back around again to like not being something I read anymore to being refreshing because it's new to me, even though the books are old. Like those I'm thinking of like early. There was like an early Spider-Man issue I have. I have the first issue of Hydro Man that I remember picking up, and like that's just it's a classic story of Spider-Man fighting Hydro Man. Like it sounds stupid when I lay it out that plainly, but I think it's something refreshing to it.
I think there's a lot of value in seeing how people thought about things in the past. Like, there's a lot of times that, you know, comics can reflect the real world, and um, it's the world outside your window in a lot of cases. And I think they're like little time capsules for that. And so it's interesting because you can go back, 20 years. We're still in the 2000s. There was something going on. There's something in the air. There's something about the moment there. You go back to the 80s. There's something in the moment there. And so yeah, I think that they're definitely worth revisiting. It's not everybody's flavor, is the thing. You have to be open to a different cadence. You have to be open to a different pace. You have to be open to different art styles, different, like the printing, coloring, like the totality of what comics is still there, but has morphed gradually. And wherever you came into comics, I'm sure I wonder if there's like a max that you're able to go back because those comics reference only up until a certain point. Like something in the 80s would have maybe referenced back into something in the 60s, something in the 60s might have referenced back to something in the 40s. Does that mean that that continues to extend back? Where do you start? There's a lot of questions there, but I think you just have to be open.
You talk about the style changing, and I'm like, remember thought bubbles?
Yeah, oh hell yeah, dude. But something as simple as that is when you see it now is like, oh my god, they did something of like a bygone era, or it's something new and refreshing. But it's weird because that was just commonplace.
I, it's funny that you say that's simple, but that is a massive landscape change in comics. Um, that's an entirely different tool and storytelling device that was just suddenly added to the landscape of comics when thought boxes or captions came out. I'm thinking specifically of Jeff Johns' Teen Titans run, where each Titan had their own color, caption box that was their inner narration or whatever. Um, one thing I think that you have to do is sort of maybe lower your expectations for what you're about to read, because they definitely, to answer the question straight, yes, they are absolutely worth reading. But the thing to remember is that nobody thought these were going to last forever. So, when Tyler said about the art only lasting half an issue or whatever, um, people 60 years later probably weren't going to be reading, New Gods #1. So I say that to say that, like, when you're looking at it, it's probably not going to unfold the way you think it does. Um, and for me, like, I mentioned New Gods. I'm going through the Jack Kirby Fourth World Omnibus on my Patreon newsletter, and one of the things that surprised me was how long it actually took to get to the New Gods. Um, it's like 4 issues of something completely unrelated that slowly starts to tie in. And really, the only thing that's got me there is Superman and Jack Kirby. I'm like, all right, I'm trusting Jack. I've trusted Jack for a long time. Everybody says trust Jack. And then boom, there's Darkseid. Oh. And then boom, there's the hand of God writing from the source wall. Okay. It's just like you have to give it the time it needs, and the space to breathe in the same way that you would a comic, from today. But like we said, it's a different pace and it's a different vision.
I think uh I think it can be tough. I mean, I definitely think it can be tough to go back and check out those older books. Like, just, you guys brought up great points. One thing that didn't come around was the fact that comics are formatted differently from a readability standpoint. Like, now comics are written for the trade, and so there is this 6-issue arc format in which most books that you're going to read are being written, especially if you're talking about big two stuff. They're written in those chunks. Whereas comics back in the day, in some cases, they didn't have arcs the way we think about them. Maybe their arc was like super long. Early Spider-Man is like issue by issue. Like, there is no arc to what's happening. And so that's something that can take getting used to. I mean, for me, I probably didn't read, like, outside of Spider-Man, which I've read every issue of Amazing Spider-Man really early on. Outside of that, I didn't go back to anything that was not sold as a classic for maybe a decade into my reading experience. Just because, like, the stuff that I went back and read that was old was really great, but it was easy for me to see how I wouldn't like it if it was done by lesser creators,
Yeah.
especially the writing.
This Fourth World omnibus is my first time doing anything before 75, I think.
Anything, like even like a spare issue here or there.
I mean, maybe a spare issue, but
Okay.
like really sitting down and giving it time,
And dissecting
Never
it. Yeah,
did
yeah.
like the spirit or something.
Not
like-
everyone's you, Marco.
Well, I am.
True. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, like famously, I have that book of Smithsonian, uh, the Smithsonian Museum book of comic books or whatever, um, that I inherited from my grandfather. I've done that, sure. And I guess, okay, to be fair, I poured over that, as a youngster, but following like a superhero comic, from page 1 all the way through, and really giving it time. This is the first time I've really like sat down with something like that.
And even like just in terms of the way you read too, it's going to be different. Like if you're talking about books from like 80s and before, you're looking at standard panel layout. like if you're reading New Gods by Ram V right now, that is a different reading experience just in terms of panel and page layout than you had before. I actually found look at doing like a quick cursory glance at this. I found a really interesting document. I'm going to throw it in the Discord about how panel layouts changed from the 40s to 2015 and how there's trends throughout going forward. Even the idea of like small panel, big block panel, smaller panel, big block panel didn't really kick up until the 90s. Even though that seems very straightforward, overlapping panels didn't really kick up to the 2000s. So just the whole experience of it seems really interesting to have to go back. And I want to say it's probably easier when it's paneled like that. You're just reading, following your eyesight. But even that like might be different for somebody who's never done it before. I have trouble reading manga, even though it's just that but backwards. So be curious.
Well, to that point, there probably wasn't as much like guiding, right? Like he nowadays you can kind of almost trace the art in the way that it'll
Emotion, yeah.
represent or drive your eye. And maybe there was less concern for that because it was, well, it's a simple panel layout. You know what you're supposed to do because, well, you pick this up for 10 cents every other day. So why wouldn't you know? Why do I have to explain? Why does the art have to hold your hand so much?
Well, I also think you really have to consider the target audience when you say that. Like comic books made before the direct market, the target audience was kids. Once publishers accepted that the direct market was the target audience, then they started to do things that they could expect the readers would catch and understand without having to consider the fact that they were children and just wanted to see cool stuff happen. And so there's definitely a space where you can acknowledge, like, whoa, these things are changing a lot. And that's going to be around the 80s. So that's why I feel like like, if you're listening to this and you're saying, yeah, I'm a newer reader and I don't know how far back to go. I think that comics that are written around 2002, 2003 to now are going to feel really similar. Basically, like from Ultimate Spider-Man to now, they're going to feel
Sure.
like what modern comics feel like.
The first Ultimate Spider-Man.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks,
When you
Bendis. Yeah.
go when you go into the 90s and you go into the 80s and the 70s, I really think, to me, there are a lot of classics there, but I also think you should curate that. You need to read the best of that era first before you start reading things you're just interested in. Like it'd be really great for you to read I like Chris Claremont X-Men and and Jim Lee and like that'll be wonderful and John Byrne, right? Because that's all great. But then if you're like, wow, but I really love Deadpool and I really like X-Force, I want to try Rob Liefeld stuff, that's going to be different. That's going to feel different. And so you need to be ready for that style before you go into it.
It's almost hard to follow characters in that way. Because even following Deadpool, like Rob Liefeld's Deadpool, is nothing like what you are used to. It's almost like I would like, oh, you like I don't know, like a soap opera drama, but it's superheroes. Then it's Claremont rather than like I like Cyclops, you know. So it's more you have to follow trends and be okay with, or just being okay with things that you're not used to and are very different.
And also like if you said, I want to read Superman from back in the day, okay, well, a lot of the Superman books that were being published in the 70s was the popular stuff was stuff like Superman Family, and Superman was a vastly different character in terms of the way that he was presented, and Jimmy Olsen was a superstar, and like there's just so many differences that a modern reader might look at that and go, that's weird as shit. And I say that as somebody who has read some of that stuff and had that feeling.
I wonder if you can consider New 52 Superman to be old now.
I mean,
It's
it's over 10 years ago.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
That'd be widely
If you're
different.
if you're listening to this in the year 2060, the current all-in era is pretty cool. Go do some archaeology on that.
The person listening to this is a cockroach because they're the ones that survived.
I think it's interesting that the pacing is probably like for me the biggest thing when it comes to how you're presenting the comics because you can you have to compress that story so much in order to really consider how you want to present that story. And so for the soap opera conversation is about, the like X-Men. I have this next to me, X-Men Life and
Oh, Life Death.
Life Death,
Yeah.
one of my favorite runs, and it is a soap opera. It's a drama. And back in the day, it was across 2 issues. It was double sized. Holy shit! That as a concept is it was mind boggling at the time. Whereas to the point made earlier, there's a lot of action. There's a lot of art focus when it comes to things like the when it comes to the 90s and underground comics, the different kinds of comics that exist outside of superheroes. That's a whole different conversation because you not only do you have things like, if you go to the 40s, the Spirit, if you go to things like the late 90s Black Hole, different art style, Mouse in this and the 70s 80s, like there's so much to explore there as well, that it's hard to even put a stamp on what you really need to watch out for on that level because storytelling is so fluid.
I mean, the indies, like R. Crumb had graphic novels and trade paperbacks
Yeah.
that collected stuff way before superhero comics did. And they almost feel more accessible than the superhero comics if you're going back in time.
I'd even argue newspaper comics, comic strips, things like that are its own kind of beast. Obviously, maybe not the thing that you'll immediately picture, but I have next to me Starhawks, Gil Kane, this
Oh,
is
that's sick.
Rangulat, phenomenal stuff from, I think it's the 50s. Sorry, mid 70s. This is post Starhawk stuff or Star Wars thing. So like even this is its own beast. It's a different format because you there was so much other comic around. It still is, but
So, yeah, I think ultimately the way that you should engage with old school books, and by old school again, I'm talking like my mentality is stuff before Ultimate Spider-Man is um do a little bit of research. I think most of us that are, been reading comics for a while, we started modern and then we said, okay, well, what's the best Batman? What's the best XYZ? Take your pick. And you go from there. And I think you will find yourself happy. But to answer the question on the title, of course, that would be like
Mm.
saying that you shouldn't go back and watch old movies. Of course, of course, of course you should. We are lucky to have a wealth of great comics that predate us because that means that we don't have to just settle for what's modern. Hey, do you think modern comics aren't great? Well, guess what? You can choose any era that existed before now, and you can be a lover of comics. Loving comics doesn't necessarily have to mean loving what comes out today. Love is love, right?
Yeah, that's what they were talking about, right, Sean?
Yes, of course. Let us know your thoughts about old school comics. Do you have any recommendations for a newer reader as to how to engage with them? And are there any treasures that you think you want to recommend to somebody who may not have read them in the comments? Leave it there. We'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care, guys.